This is the third part for the audiobook for Non-Being and Nothingness by the non-philosopher Tim Snavely. Me. If you haven't read or heard the two parts before this, go watch those first. But either way, here we go. Chapter 10. Critique of the critique, the of, the pure, and the reason. And a lot of my work in the future, zilch willing, will be in the further negation of notable things resting on those four rocks: devotions to God, science, philanthropy, and self-discipline. Sensei Snavely is a master negator. Yes, being a master negator is a part of my amness. Splendid. Now I shall say master negator 3 times really fast, just for amusement's sake, seeing that the English audiobook would make listeners hear words that sound like masturbator. Ready? Here we go. Master negator, master negator, master negator. So I now believe it would seem appropriate for me to take an active part in negating the 2 predecessor books in this multi-generational, multinational, and multi-language trilogy, and another tangentially related book, as to conclude this book in this order: 17th century German Immanuel Kant's Critique of Pure Reason, 20th century German Martin Heidegger's Being and Time, the first of our multi-thinker trilogy, and 20th century Frenchman Jean-Paul Sartre's Being and Nothingness, the second of our trilogy, with a final meta-negation of Non-Being and Nothingness by the silly 21st century English-speaking American. To begin critiquing the critique of pure reason, I see no reason to reason that the reason that is being critiqued is pure, as I've said already. For purity implies that only the thing in question exists within itself, as reason in itself. But what would reason alone even look like? Although I agree that space and time are a priori concepts, and I see that both of these dimensions are required for a reasoning reason to demonstrate being an active thought, is that enough for the rationale alone to label itself as pure? I don't think so. I don't think it is. Earlier, I brought to our collective reasoning the quantum vacuum bit to demonstrate how all reason could reasonably reside within a 0D point, simulating what we call reasoning. Thus, even these 2 fundamental a priori dimensions may be in error, assuming space and time where there is none via nothing as a non-being QVB. And since this hypothesis of there being a thing of pure reason is as non-negatable as the null hypothesis that opposes it, the purity of the reason will always be a thing in question. Once an a priori facet of knowledge is found or deduced, by what method can we test it for impurities? Shall we use the same method used to finding the knowledge in the first place? Cannot we see this for the nonsense that it is? The claim of discovering nuggets of knowledge with reason alone, whilst using a reason that was produced after years of experience finding out which reasons were reasonable and which ones weren't. May I make the same claim that I have discovered pure nothingness with nonsense alone, whilst using nonsense that took years of experience finding out which nonsenses were nonsensical and which ones weren't? Within the word, you could even see how the nonsense parallels the pure reason, which sought to remove all sensuous experiences from the reasonings. Therefore, the pure reason that negates the experiences of the senses would be better labeled as pure nonsense from the get-go. Beyond these things, I found myself annoyed by what I perceived to be an incessant need for order in Kant's mind, which sometimes led to tunneled thinking as opposed to critical thinking. For example, about 100 pages into my translation, Kant speaks of Aristotle's table of categories of quantity, quality, relation, and modality, and notes. In each class, the number of categories is always the same, namely 3. He mistook the number of examples given within each class as the exhaustive number of examples each class was capable of providing. And just to provide an additional example or two, we could add equivalence to relation and total negation and emptiness to quantity. He considered space and time to be under the new category of pure concepts, but barred himself from doing so because, I assume, he thought it would ruin Aristotle's perfect order of three, since the pure concept category would only have two. Perhaps if he rose from the dead to read this book, he would maintain his order of three by substantively adding nothing to this pure concept class. But again, the pureness of even those three pure concepts would still be up for questioning to determine if the rationale behind the questions is itself tainted with impurities. Pure and extraordinary sense is muddied by the senses, so to speak. And whilst we are alive beings in action, it's not like we can just become blind and deaf and untasting and unsmelling and unfeeling and unbalanced for the purpose of attaining pure reason. It would literally be senseless to attempt such a feat. And concerning senselessness, it frustrates me to no end that both Kant and Heidegger, both of whom had a near universal utility to add to the philosophical field, wrote their highest acclaimed works in such a way that it took over 200 pages for me to even begin to acknowledge their brilliance. I'm not saying that I think I'm the standard for brilliance, but rather I think that I have already been influenced by Einstein in the sense that I believe if you can't explain something simply, you don't understand it well enough. And to me, it is senseless to overcomplicate these relatively simple concepts introduced, even if it was the first time some of these concepts were introduced to that level of depth. For Kant in particular, I had to put his book back on the shelf after 111 pages in pure frustration, inspiring me with the thought to make a video of me burning the book as the thumbnail under the title of Critique of Pure Garbage. Thankfully, I could not do that with a clear conscience without reading the whole thing, and thus, Critique of Pure Garbage was itself tossed away in my mind's trash bin after acknowledging that he started making sense after a gruesome 266 pages from my perspective in my translation. In hindsight, Kant and I would agree on a few core issues, the main agreement being that empiricism and rationalism are both incomplete concerning the applicability to find the truths they set out to find. Empiricism lacks its ontological basis, relying on its observations of appearance to determine their truths. Thus, the core issue of being is bypassed and ignored entirely. And the limits of rationalism are easy enough to lay out in full detail, that is to say, everything pure reason could ever achieve, that I will stick it at the end of this book like it was nothing. The transcendental middle ground between these two schools of thought is that, and has been, the transcendental middle ground between these two schools of thought is and has been the way of the scientific process since the Enlightenment. But as I have hopefully demonstrated adequately earlier in this work, where I differ from Kant is that if the concepts of space and time are a priori, then the concepts of at least one of the two matter dimensions of mass or electromagnetism would also be required to maintain their a priori validity as being ontologically certain. Because without them, to actualize different points of contact between space, or the changes that occur over time, space and time themselves would be obsolete as being indistinguishable from non-space and non-time. As a matter of fact, pure mass and pure light cannot be observed independently, since mass is what's needed to resist the light from going through a would-be observer who could verify the action, but I digress. To continue contrasting myself with Kant, I will present a full paragraph of his and elaborate on how exactly transcendental empiricism works when it is literally based on nothing in light of his observations. Thus we find that pure reason, which at first seemed to promise nothing less than expansion of our knowledge beyond all limits of experience, contains, if properly understood, nothing but regulative principles, which do indeed postulate greater unity than the empirical use of the understanding can ever achieve. Yet, by the very fact that they place the goal which has to be reached at so great a distance, they carry the agreement of the understanding with itself, by means of systemic unity to the highest possible degree. But if they are misunderstood and mistaken for constitutive principles of transcendent knowledge, they produce, by a brilliant but deceptive illusion, persuasion and imaginary knowledge, by thereby constant contradictions and disputes. In other words, from his perspective, the knowledge obtained from science, even with the transcendental principles contained in the scientific method, would lead to a convincing set of pseudoscientific knowledge. It's as if the reliability of replicatable appearances means nothing towards the pursuit of truth. It's as if sticking your head in the sand and ignoring the utility of a posteriori knowledge entirely is better than reason based on transcendental reason, which is ultimately based on nothing and get us nowhere anyways. But if we start from nothing from the get-go, and also, I admit, a transcendental philological method that defines the orders of reason within it, both the empiricists and the rationalists would benefit. Empiricists would finally, as they have merely presupposed so far, have an ontological basis for their knowledge by relying on the mass electric space-time dimensions as the transcendental definition for the objective world that is being. Each dimension is a continuum that contains the possibility and capacity for beingness to emerge in the world as action, for without them, all that would remain is non-being. And rationalists would then, likewise, have a reason to stick their heads out of the sand and use the sand to help make some concrete, so to speak. Once nothingness is truly known in its totality, as its simultaneous non-applicability and zero magnitude for every substantive dimension, the systemic unity of a dimensionalist system would then be capable of being tested with philological, mathematical, and physical means, rather than stick with the near-meaningless qualitative sand salads that have been the sustenance for wisdom since the dawn of man. Only then can philosophy meaningfully progress, when it humbles itself to be critiqued and upheld by empirical methods. Chapter 11. This be non-being or being dead? Heidegger's being in time thankfully did not have the same strict issues Kant appeared to have. For what it is worth, I think Heidi did an excellent job of providing a solid ontological definition for his Dyson, albeit an unnecessarily overcomplicated one. Using my words to summarize this work, Dyson is the isness of being, the it at the core of what it is. And the latter third of the book proves to a reasonable degree that this Dyson exists, or is, in time, which I hope I made it easier to understand by noting how being requires either real or potential action, which could only ever happen within time. Just as the concept of running requires a runner to endure for a time, so does the concept of being require a Dyson to endure for a time. Even if I were to assert that the Dyson is ultimately null, we would still be left with null is being and enduring for a time. Whether we assert that which is being is something like Dyson or null, it is irrefutable for the well-reasoned individual that it is ultimately a thing, even whilst being as no thing in particular. So naturally, where I diverge from Heidegger is rather than dismiss the possible negation of this thing in question, I embrace it, and even add it as a necessary ontological component of this thing in question. Its isness is the positive assertion and explanation of the dipolar authenticity and inauthenticity aspect of the Dyson. The concepts were simple to understand in this book, but frustrating, because Heidegger appeared to have a tendency to really build up to what he was about to say rather than just say it. It led to frustrations and thoughts that were left incomplete for several hundred pages, which in real-world reading time took well over a month to complete, in its soundness in my mind. For example, around page 98 of my translation, he speaks of the ready-to-hand as a totality of equipmentality that had already been discovered, not a direct quote, which any critically thinking mind would deduce is impossible to do. Calculating every probable action and discovering them for a single piece of equipment would take the rest of time to discover. And it wasn't until page 191 that it was clarified that this totality need not be grasped explicitly by a thematic interpretation. 93 whole pages of me assuming it did, since that is what discovery implies. And on a somewhat unrelated note that just happened to show up next in my notes on the book, Heidi's hyper use of hyphens to an absurd level may have inspired the even more absurd hyper use of hyphens in this book. I believe his longest streak was 8 words long, in which he used the phrase being just present at hand and no more to describe a recently deceased person who is being no longer in the world. Once I read that, I knew I had to increase this absurdity on several fronts, even if my editor didn't like it so much, even after she read this explanation as a meta-joke for philosophers. And Sartre even added to this unnecessary absurdity using this 10-word long streak, being in the midst of the world for the other. So for this existential trilogy, it was only fitting that I include the serious common phrase, the 9-word, being in the world alongside us in human reality, and the ridiculously long 129-word that involved tacos and Frank's hot sauce. Psychologically speaking, I would guess that this particular mode of absurdity stems from the attempts at finding meaning beyond the ontological bare minimum of being in itself. This rut in philosophy, observed by outsiders as an indication of death in a dead field of study, may likely have its roots in the overwhelming majority embrace of being as the primary means to build the field further, whilst also rejecting the Cartesian mode of examining both the physical and metaphysical features of the thing in question that the rest of the hierarchy of sciences depend on. It gives me this vision of 2 cavemen philosophers having this absolute straw man of a conversation that in all, really isn't too far from the truth. I found meaning. Yes, do tell. Meaning is being. Yes, is. Say more. Being implies a being. Hits head with a coconut. A being? What is a being doing? Slides in closely and sensuously, whispers in ear. Being. Ejaculates in ecstasy. Meaning is a being being. Does a being have another a being, or a being alone? Stops to ponder. Me no know. Maybe a being alone together with I. Eats a banana peel. 1, I being. 2, a being. Therefore, 2 beings be being. Throws the remaining banana fruit into the face of the peel eater. Not 2 beings. 3. Slips into a happy coma for 1 second to arise and be amazed. 3? Yes. 1. I being. 2. Other being. 3. We are all being in the world. The world is being 3. No. A being implies a world for a being to be being in. The world in the ing of the being. I hand over coconut. Hits head with coconut, bursting the coconut open. But can being just be? Or just be non-being? Gets stung by a bee. Extinguishes the life from the bee. This bee be non-being. No, this bee be being by being dead. I could go on for pages more, but I think I've made my point. This straw man imaginary exchange that has appeared to go on for about a century could have been avoided by elaborating on the features that are required for a being to be a being. Moving beyond the bare minimum verbs and nouns, use adjectives and prepositions to create meaningful relational connections and actually investigate how it is and what dimensions are useful to describe and distinguish between these different modes of being. Can ontology still be a basis for future Cartesian dimensionalism? Absolutely. For then we can allow these dimensions, especially the ontologically necessary ones for being in the first place, the ones that allow us to be being in action, mass electric space-time phenomena, to be the fundamental basis for elaboration on what beings are doing. We, and by we I mean everything, express our being by the fundamental interactions of these four necessary dimensions that hold/maintain certain properties inherently, and others prescribed after the fact. Without these four dimensions interacting the way they do, our being would be indiscriminate, indiscernible from non-being. Using Heidegger's analogy, the hammer's features don't make the hammer, but the ability to use the hammer as equipment makes the hammer. But where we, and by we I mean the global society of critical thinkers, must continue is in recognizing this same hammer can only truly begin being a hammer within the confines of its common contextual background in the world. The hammer doesn't exist in a vacuum. The primal language of grabbing the hammer and using it as a hammer, as equipment that is ready to hand, cannot be done without taking the time to close the space between yourself and the hammer, grasping it in your mass electric space-time hands, and move the motherfucking hammer in relation to other objects in the world with force, which is mass times space divided by time squared. The dimensions aren't just in the background of the world, but within the very fabric of our being in the world, and in each other's being in the world alongside us in human reality, which includes the hammer. We move the hammer into action. We move our bodies into action. We move our thoughts into active thought. And really, this is telling us nothing new that we have recognized since we were children. Why does it take big null brains to push us forward in such an obvious manner? To move beyond being, get out of our heads, so to speak, and genuinely explore the world and the universe. To not stop at, we are here, but to continue the definition of here and ask, what's over there? To be as clear as reasonably possible, I am not saying that the dimensions have an ontological necessity for our very being, since I have already said that the dimensions manifest as features of our amness that add nothing new or necessary to our being. What I am saying is that the dimensions do have an ontological necessity for the world itself that holds our being, and this is an ontological necessity for our being in the world in human reality. The time that Heidegger observed we are being in is both a dimension and feature that, in addition to space and matter, are necessary for meaningful actions and relations to occur in the world alongside us in human reality. matter's mass-electric dimensions can now finally be justified as necessary features of the world, because if all that existed was I, a null thing, space and time, then space and time and the world would disappear, since there would be no other point of reference for any action in the world to take place at all. So the mass and electric dimensions are themselves the distinguishing points of contact amidst space and time that allow action to take place in the first place. This logic shows how these primary dimensions are codependent on each other. Space-time requires the mass-electric to be either reasonably distinguished or empirically observed in the world, and the mass-electric requires space-time to begin being in action in the world. And because my actions are distinct from your actions in the world, and your actions can thwart, obstruct, and possibly even stop my actions, your being to me as an other, and any being to you as an other, is as certain, nay, is indistinguishable from the world in itself. We are the world. The world's isness is our collective amness, which is our arness. We are beings in action in and as mass-electric space-time and as the world amongst ourselves and human reality until we are non-being. All in hyphens. You are what I am not, and I am not what you are, and we are here. Together we are one. Even whilst alone, I am a none. We are mass-electric space-time, and we are null. We are everything split, and we are everything whole. We are going our own ways, and we are going nowhere in particular. And I know that I know nothing, and that this knowledge will help us understand ourselves as everything better. We are not the dimensions in themselves, but we are the points that make up the dimensions of the world. We grab ourselves by the mass, see ourselves by our light, and distance ourselves from ourselves in an effort to go our own ways with whatever time we have. Our ourness is the world. Can I, after all this, go back to Heidegger? What else can I say? That the magnum opus didn't make for an easy read until page 274? Or that his statement on page 266 that every uncoveredness is an uncoveredness of something made me think of Scooby-Doo's Headless Horseman having 20 masks on, only to reveal the real Headless Horseman was, in fact, the real Headless Horseman the whole time, to demonstrate how the multiplicity of useless masks was demonstrated? Or that his saying, temporality is the reason for the clock, was taken from the handbook of Captain Obvious. No, I don't think much more needs to be said in this medium. He was an inspiration of his time, and still is several generations later, and without him, neither Sartre's book nor this one would have been made possible. But I do not envy the scholars of Heidi in the slightest, due to his overly complicated language. Nietzsche is the better writer from what I've read, and I can only hope to compare to his, Nietzsche's, timeless wit if I fail to go beyond it. The brevity of his work, even amidst its intentionally unnecessary redundancies, hopes to be a welcoming relief compared to the headaches endured whilst reading long-winded philosophers like Heidegger. Chapter 12. Being the negation of the negation of the negation. But for now, I will move on to Sartre. Contrary to popular opinion, I do consider that the Frenchman was on the right track on where to progress from Heidegger. After all, we both think somewhat Cartesianally, and both take the topics of nothing and radical centrism seriously. There were many times that I found myself discouraged from writing this book because a lot of his existential observations were dead on target, and I have no desire to steal a profound thinker's thunder if I had nothing useful to add to the thunderclap. For example, his observation that nothingness cannot be nothingness without annihilating itself explicitly as the nothingness of the world, was a novel concept to me. The active mode of negation itself, even of itself, is an inherent attribute of the void. It was an absolutely fascinating thought to deposit into my brain bank. What else would that mean to me other than our being honors the futile sacrifice of the void's self-nullification? It also came to my attention that Sartre's negations and self-negations in not being actually don't negate Heidegger's use of being, as was intended. Not being is still a mode of being, namely, being what it is not. Don't get me wrong, Sartre's observations are phenomenally self-consistent, even if they aren't ontologically consistent with what Heidi was saying. But I will say in criticism that Sartre has undergone the tendency to make assertions without adequately backing them up. Even if I perhaps also tend to have this problem, it's hard not to be when there isn't exactly any peer reviewing going on at the moment. For example, there was this passage saying the woman who was sexually dissatisfied was at fault for divorcing her object from her subject, or something like that, rather than postulating that the man may have had a part to play as well, namely, being not good at the sex. A hypothesis asserted by the questionable practices of Freudian psychoanalysis does not adequately question the null hypothesis, nor other substantiated hypotheses. There was also this paragraph full of unnecessary and petty tautologies. I should probably parody it and be even more precise than I was earlier by saying X is not X, because the first X is conceived at a different time. Therefore, every X is a different X. So we can say that although equivalence can be approximately demonstrated within the world, absolutely true equivalence amongst the multitude of things, to make sense, must exist beyond mass electric spacetime and not within it. But moving on to page 139 of Being and Nothingness, there was this small statement that got me thinking. For it is only by means of a lack that a lack can come from being. I think all I need to do here for commentary here is provide a counterexample. Like, I have a sack of spoiled potatoes, but I lack safe food. Thus, from the potatoes being spoiled potatoes, did a lack of edible food arise. And on page 263 of my translation, I got really riled up and spent way too much time reflecting on it. When Sartre says, a quality cannot be objectified if it is subjective. I say the object is subjectified. If there is consensus between subjects about the objective dimensions of the object, then the quality of a particular shade of color, subjective, can be demonstrated to have one or more electromagnetic wavelengths interacting with different intensities, objective. And when he said, it is the lemon's acidity that is yellow, I didn't hold back from an acerbic tone myself and considered the statement spoken by a moron, simply because he was attributing one kind of descriptor for another and actually attributing charge to wavelength. It's a false equivalence to say the lemon is acidic and the lemon is yellow. Therefore, the acidic is yellow. Using only two different dimensions of the lemon used to explain the totality of the lemon is wrong. Even the same dimension of color shows this error for multicolored objects. Cow is white, and the same cow is black. Therefore, white is black. And at last, when his words were translated to say, the jam's sticky coldness is a revelation of its sweet taste to my fingers, I had to give a hearty laugh. This guy has clearly never felt and tasted any remnants of the early 21st century slime craze, which would clearly expose the sticky coldness revelation as being the early 21st century slime craze which would clearly expose the sticky coldness revelation to be revealing nada about the cold and sticky thing's sweetness. Reason with me here. So long as something is, the parts of its isness are small and cumulative to the whole thing in question. When talking about nothing, we can say zilch is nada, but when nothing is something, as 0 to the 0th power things, we cannot say the parts of the thing that is being are null. Otherwise, the isness of null would be its own is notness. I am aware that this appears to contradict what I said earlier about its isness is what it is not, but it doesn't. To elaborate, being in this work is indeterminate between being absolute, 1, and non-being, 0. The totality of isness that is knowable is as close to being absolute that we can get, where all that remains is non-being. But it cannot be known that we know it 100%, because the relational attributes of other things also need to be known in full as well for being absolute to emerge for a thing. So really, no thing can be known fully, which leaves parts of a thing isness to be desired, but nothing cannot be known fully, which is a thing's is notness in its totality. Chapter 13. This is it! Now, I hate to talk about this, but Sartre begs me from beyond his grave to do it. This is so important compared to all that it transcends that to be this. The thisness is the isness that is its isness, that is its itness. There is no doubt about it. It is beyond the capability of being doubted. This is certain. It cannot be made any clearer than this. For if it was any less clear, it would be that, and that would be outrageously absurd. This is it. Not as an anticipatory is, as a linking verb in time, but an equivocation is, that tells it like it is. It is so certain that nothing, nay, not even nothing, is capable of negating it. In all seriousness, if it was not this, then it would be that. Can it be both this and that? Absolutely, because I just said so, like a distinguished, not a doctorate of philosophy. But now this is important, because even though this is not that, and this is it is also that, making it the certain commonality between this and that. Is it nothing? Possibly. We would be foolish to negate the possibility so soon. Could it, being nothing, be true? If and only if that is false. To make it true that falsehoods have nothing in common with truth and pure reason. That is it if it is false. And that is all I have to say about that. But if that's the case, then this couldn't be further from the truth. Is this a lie worth believing? If it is the case that that is the case, then where does that leave this? Shall we leave this to its own devices? As if we had any other choice, which we do. Either this is true, or that is true. Or it is true, making both this and that true. Or nothing is true, making both this and that false. Or it is nothing is true, which makes nothing important. Which makes it important as well, which makes this and that importantly unimportant. Is that all? No. Is this and that all? Of course not. But is this and that it? Yes, but incompletely so. Is this, that, and the other it and not it? So long as the other is null, yes. Is this the other? No, it's that. Is the other all of that? Yes. Shall I go on with this? I could, but I'd rather move on to that. That is, if you will allow me such a luxury to skip over to its end. And the Lord says, Zilch says, it is finished. And the Jesus Christ Null also said, it is finished. But the Holy Spirit says to you, it's not over yet. Its nonsense endures forever. Ramen. But is it under? Okay, I'm just kidding. I'm done now. But commenting on Sartre isn't, and that is where we shall continue. Between pages 391 and 394 of his 811-page Chonky Boy, I had a vision. A silly vision of me getting on a stage and demonstrating my shamelessness and consideration for the other by allowing those who would feel shamed upon seeing my nakedness to leave, to demonstrate my being without shame. But in this section, Sartre appears to think such a demonstration would be an act of pride, namely projectionally saying something like, I aim to make use of this beauty or strength or intelligence that the other confers on me insofar as they constitute me as an object in order to assign to them, be reversing the direction of flow, a passive feeling of admiration or love. Saying elsewhere that such shamelessness would be already a reaction of flight, of shame of being an object in bad faith. To say shame is completely non-negatable is just weird within the context of the rest of the book, of the rest of his book. Now, to his credit, around my translations, pages 415 to 416, Sartre appeared to be saying, as I've already said more clearly, that the dimensions of an object are indistinguishable from the dimensions of the world, by saying exactly, and I quote, "But it is we ourselves who decide on these dimensions through our very arising in the world, and we have to decide on them, otherwise we would not be at all. Pure knowledge would in effect be knowledge without any point of view, and therefore a knowledge of the world that was necessarily situated outside the world. But that has no meaning. The knowing being would only be knowledge, as he would be defined by his object, and his object would disappear within the complete lack of distinction of reciprocal relations. Thus, knowledge can only be something that arises when someone engaged within a determinate point of view. In other words, within the world, within mass electric space-time, that he is, that is an ontological necessity. This is so eloquently insightful that I happily reproduce it to give credit where it is due. I don't even have any words to add to it. It was so on point. But nearing page 431, my frustration as a psychologist with the philosopher reached a boiling point. So I shall aid both fields by providing a reasonable defense of the existing ontology required to uphold the field of psychology as it is, since it appears that this kind of thinking has thoroughly permeated all fields of modern science. Assuming I understood Jean Paul correctly, he seemed to adamantly dismiss psychological subjectivity as the primary means of understanding objective phenomena with perception. I say that it is, in fact, this dismissal that leads to what he called a paradox of a physical instrument being handled by a mind. All sensations that are perceived are connected to the brain via the central nervous system. The body is the neurons and the nerves, and the mind is merely the interpretation of what the sensations mean, which is ambiguous. This is the extent to which distinguishing consciousness from the brain is useful, precisely because beyond this distinction, the mind is the brain. And the nervous system assists the brain in sensing phenomena to help decide which actions would be most beneficial in maintaining equilibrium. Even the self-reflective and self-aware process of consciousness can be readily observed to still require these neurons' ability to communicate with each other. Although some forms of consciousness being detached from the body as a sensory experience are not completely devoid of evidence themselves, their frequency in occurrences is too infrequent to be deemed a reliable truth to adhere to. This sort of thinking showed up again when Sartre said, the psychologists ought to have asked themselves what sort of ontological structure could belong to a phenomenon that is acquainted with what it is by something that has not yet come to be. In making such an ontological structure clear, as if others haven't done so already, the thought processes behind active imagination, ontologically requiring active neurons to extrapolate future likely but uncertain possibilities, is all that is required here. Behavior doesn't require ontology below action in itself, since actions must be physical to be in the world. However, to appease the likes of Sartre, the full answer to the question he proposed that psychologists ask themselves is stated here to be the actions of neurons communicating with each other from which new actions are performed in the world is the ontological basis for psychology. If actions are observed in the world, they can and should be tested and studied rigorously to more fully grasp the isness of the phenomenon in question, which are questions originating from a complex neural network. Or did I not understand the question at hand? Surely I didn't misunderstand. That's all for this one. Just one more.